The heads of a hydra stared back at the professor from the face of the coin. Her mind was elsewhere. Mostly cursing the cold. "Congratulations," she thought sarcastically. "You ventured further north than any previous expedition ever dared." One of the logs on the fire chose that moment to collapse, the crackling of the spray of sparks sounding to the professor like applause. "And now you know why no previous expedition ever dared," her thoughts continued. "It's because it gets, to use the old mannish expression, ball-achingly cold." Men, the professor thought. It always comes back to men, not males. She could hear the orc innkeeper in the cellar grunting as he rearranged barrels. But men. Humans. They were amongst the greatest of enigmas. From the beginning of recorded lore, men had played an outsized role in it. In the Age of War, it had been men who had always commanded the armies, men who had always volunteered for the most perilous missions. In this Age of Peace, it had been men who had conceded their lands to bring an end to the wars for resources, men who had emptied their treasuries to build the trade roads, and by doing so forged chains of symbiotic relationships. It seemed that wherever there was any great upheaval, men were always in the middle of it. And then, one day, men just went away. There was no war, no plague, no famine, but also no men, just memories and monuments. As time passed, the panic caused by the disappearance of men faded, and as generations passed, men became almost mythical creatures. Still, the question of what had befallen them remained unanswered, as did, more worryingly, the question of whether whatever had happened to men could happen to another race. The professor sighed inwardly. "And so the Faculty of Law funds these expeditions, and I chase a rumor to this place, where a warm day is almost a myth," she thought. The professor shifted, trying to make herself comfortable in an armchair made for a member of a race typically far larger than hers, and the warm but maddeningly itchy woolen garment she had brought from one of the townswomen. She was glad that there were no other patrons in the inn at this time in the afternoon, who she might have needed to compete with for her place by the fire, or who might have necessitated her using her magics. The innkeeper appreciated the subtle glamours she could weave, making his establishment seem more warm and inviting, as well as the less subtle illusions the professor could weave, convincing patrons who were drunk and heading towards, and disorderly, that it really was time to leave, and had, very grudgingly, occasionally muttering about bloody knife ears, reduced the rate he was charging her for a room, as long as her magics were benefiting him. The professor once again sighed inwardly. Maybe the Faculty of Law will be so pleased with my fiscal responsibility that they'll overlook my expedition being a failure, she thought dejectedly. In truth, she knew that nobody, not even herself, was really expecting her expedition to discover the fate of men, where so many expeditions before hers had failed. Still, she hadn't been able to entirely quieten her feelings of hope when she had detoured to this little town on the border of nowhere, after hearing rumors that a number of people had seen a figure in the nearby woods that resembled the description of a man. The professor scowled. She would have preferred it if the rumors had been a complete fabrication, for the truth was somehow more disappointing. A halfling recluse who had fashioned himself a pair of stilts in order to keep his feet out of the snow. The professor idly rubbed a thumb over a face of the coin. "Heads, I'll continue this expedition. Tail, I'll return to the university," she resolved. A deft hand movement sent the coin spinning into the air. A figure was closing the door to the inn behind it, and the professor's senses were shouting at her that something was wrong. She snatched the coin out of the air, so as not to have it clatter and alert the figure. As she snatched too at the threads of magic, ready to weave illusion to hide herself from mundane sight if she needed to flee, or to confuse her opponent about the whereabouts of her blade if she needed to fight. But the figure, seemingly oblivious to the professor and her pounding heart, took the few steps to the counter and rang the crude iron bell there to get the innkeeper's attention. With the figure's back to her, and its attention focused on the innkeeper, who had been summoned from the cellar by the sound of the bell and the possibility of coin, the professor took a moment to try to calm herself and take stock. The innkeeper didn't seem to be at all alarmed by the figure. But, the professor thought, the typical orc senses are far less acute than my race's. The figure was dressed for the weather, the professor noted, in a dark, thick, hooded cloak, boots and gloves. It stood a little shorter than an elf and a lot shorter than an orc, and although its clothes could be deceiving, it seemed to be broader than the former, whilst not being as broad as the latter. The professor pulled gently on the threads of magic, surreptitiously checking for any glamour on or illusion about the figure, but found not a trace. What's wrong here? She thought. And a heartbeat later she saw it. Although the figure had walked in on a typical afternoon here in the north, there was no snow on his cloak, no mud on his boots. It was as though it had simply decided that the weather didn't apply to it, and the weather had complied. As the professor struggled to think of an explanation, the innkeeper pointed in her direction, and the figure began to turn to walk towards where she was sitting. The professor pulled more roughly on the threads of magic, weaving illusion. Mundane sight would perceive her as resting her chin on a fist as she stared at the coin in her other hand. It would take magical ability to see through her illusion and see her as fully alert, a hand on the blade that hung from her belt. Professor. The figure addressed her with a nod of his head. The illusion reacted as though slightly startled by its thoughts being interrupted, whilst the professor studied the figure and found it nondescript, but in a way remarkable for how unremarkable it was. Its face wasn't as fine as was typical for a member of her race, but wasn't as plump as a halfling's, and was androgynous. His voice was similar, pitched too high for a male, but too low for a female. His garb was of obviously high-quality material and masterfully fashioned, but was bereft of any ornamentation, and a hope was kindling in the professor. You have me at a disadvantage. The professor heard her voice come from the illusion's mouth. You apparently know of me, but I don't believe that we have ever met. The figure skirted a small table adorned with a collection of dirty mugs and sank into one of the armchairs. You are correct, it stated. We have never before met, and I do not have a name I can give you, for I have only a title. Emissary. No! The professor almost shouted in annoyance, interrupting the illusion, beginning to say something vacuous and causing the innkeeper to glance in her direction. Seeing no weapons being brandished, he returned to redistributing the grime on the countertop. There was a blur as the illusion unravelled. No, the professor stated, a little more calmly. I will not be mocked. This is a trick. Plenty of the townsfolk knew of my reason for venturing this far. One of them put you up to this. The emissary gave a wan smile. You don't truly believe that, it stated, and this is no trick. I'm human, a man in your tongue. So many expeditions before mine ended in failure. Why do you appear now to me? The professor asked, a myriad of emotions in her voice. I appear to you because we have watched you seek knowledge, even when the quest brings you discomfort. Physical. The emissary gestured to indicate the less than hospitable world on the other side of the door to the inn, or intellectual, and I appear now because we have completed our deliberations. And what deliberations were those? The professor asked. When you were a child, did you ever play make-believe? The emissary asked, ignoring the professor's question. Yes, the professor answered with a confused nod, but I don't understand what that has to do with anything. The emissary gave a sigh. We did too, it stated. We have always sought to escape from our world and into fantasy. We told one another stories, we put on plays, we wrote books, and as our knowledge grew, we learned to create worlds we could step into. And one of those worlds we populated with orcs and elves, dragons and halflings. The professor didn't feel the emissary paw on the threads of magic, but now there appeared to be a game board atop the table between the armchairs, with two carved wooden figures representing a mannish warrior and a dragon on it. But we felt that the world we had created lacked verisimilitude. At first, we strove to simply make that world look more real. The emissary continued, as the figures on the game board became more finely carved, paint spreading across them to give them colour and pick out details. But, paradoxically, the more that world looked real, the less believable we found it. As we expected the people and beasts with which we had populated it to behave as though they were real, alive. And so we strove to make them behave as though they were alive, the emissary stated, as the warrior and dragon began to move, the latter stalking the former across the game board. And something amazing happened. We succeeded. As the emissary paused, the warrior dodged a burst of pseudo-flame from the dragon by hiding behind a mug, but the professor was paying no heed to the silent struggle playing out on the table. She had an intimation of what was to come. But something terrible happened too, resumed the emissary. For a long time we didn't realize just how well we had succeeded. I am not a plaything, the professor almost spat. No, agreed the emissary with a nod. You are not. Any longer. That is one of the outcomes of our deliberations. One of the things I have to tell you, that for ill or for good, men will no longer meddle in this world. Your world, now. It finished softly. Your future is in your own hands. If you wage war, it will be because you have chosen to do so, not because we thought that it would be a grand adventure. The emissary paused for a long time. The professor could hear the rhythmic scrunch of boots compressing snow as townfolk passed near to the inn, but none entered. The professor intuited that something akin to, but the opposite of, the glamours she often wove was in effect, making the establishment seem cold and uninviting. There is another thing I have to tell you, the emissary finally continued. That we meddled one final time in your world. Your world is still a cage, but it now has a key. The professor gave a snort in spite of herself. Am I to go on a quest for that key? She asked, facetiously. I'm in the traditional place to recruit a party, but I don't see a halfling thief or a dwarven cleric, she gestured, the sweep of her arm taken in the inn empty but for the two of them and the innkeeper. The emissary gave a wan smile. The key isn't a thing to hold in your hand, rather it's a state of mind, the ability to reason. I am not a dumb beast, the professor objected. No, the emissary again agreed with a nod. You are not, but you might liken the necessary state of mind to a bird choosing to forgo flight. In order to truly be able to reason, to truly understand your world and turn the key to your cage, you, as a people, must let magic die. Are we also to let our civilization die? The professor asked in disbelief. Magic is the foundation, magic is a safety net, and building your civilization on it has held you back, the emissary interrupted her. But it isn't my role to convince you what choice to make, it continued with a sigh. Only to tell you that there is a choice. The emissary gave another of his wan smiles. But I will tell you that men never had magic, it stated. So unlike you, we never had a choice but to learn to understand our world, not if we wanted to survive it. The emissary stood and took a few steps towards the door to the inn, but paused by the professor's armchair. There is one final thing I have to ask you, the emissary stated. You, the people of this world, remembered us when we hadn't set foot upon it in generations. So please remember, too, that we are sorry for our ignorant meddling, and that we try to make amends. Then the emissary was gone from the inn, and the world. The heads of a hydra stared back at the professor from the face of the coin. Her mind was elsewhere.